Hey, this is Miss Cooper here with your Week 6, Chapter 6 commentary video for African American Studies. And we're going to read and summarize. Basically, on this week, we're going to be dealing with African Americans and the New Deal, African Americans as we move up to the period of World War II. And our objective, we're still seeking central ideas, using words in context, and determining point of view. So we want to pay attention to this document. Be sure that you follow along with the reading and take all of your facts and follow all instructions. Virtually ignored by the Republican administration of the 1920s, black voters drifted to the Democratic Party, especially in the northern cities. In the presidential election of 1928, African Americans voted in large numbers for the Democrats for the first time. In 1930, Republican President Herbert Hoover nominated John J. Parker, a man of pronounced anti-black views, to the U.S. Supreme Court. The NAACP successfully opposed the nomination. In the 1932 presidential race, African Americans overwhelmingly supported the successful Democratic candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Roosevelt administration's accessibility to African American leaders and the New Deal reforms strengthened black support for the Democratic Party. A number of African American leaders, members of a so-called black cabinet, were advisors to Roosevelt. Among them were the educator Mary McLeod Bethune, who served as the National Youth Administration's Director of Negro Affairs, William H. Hastie, who in 1937 became the first black federal judge, Eugene K. Jones, Executive Secretary of the National Urban League, Robert Vann, editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, and the economist Robert C. Weaver. So see, in just those two paragraphs, we've got several names attached to dates, and we are looking at the central idea. And what we want to understand is the original party that abolished slavery was the Republican Party. And Abraham Lincoln was a Republican president. But remember, he was assassinated. And Reconstruction was a failure. When we moved into the Harlem Renaissance, more educators, more prominent African Americans, and their work bloomed, it flourished. And you have things changing, things shifting. Okay, an essential question here would be how does innovation or how does art affect ways of life? Well, oftentimes people listen to music or they listen to the words of authors and philosophers, and they begin to have a change of heart. And when you see a demographic shift into one political party or another, usually there are reasons behind that. So the Republican Party, as you heard, began to ignore the African Americans. After Lincoln is assassinated and the so-called Reconstruction movement does not really provide any help or assistance for African Americans, they began to seek other avenues to get the help that they need and to be allowed to express themselves and be a part of the democratic process. So the Democratic Party becomes the place. And that's interesting because today we would have you think that the Republicans are the bad guys, always have been, but the Republicans started with Abraham Lincoln as their president. Okay, so keep that in mind that we shifted to the Democratic Party. And party is not as important as policy. So try your best to remember when you are able to vote. Do not worry about the party. Worry about policies, worry about principles, and be a free thinker, okay? Pay attention to the people who are in those offices and in those positions and what it is that they are presenting to the public. So, here in the next paragraph, it says African Americans benefited greatly from New Deal programs through discrimination, though discrimination by local administrators was common. Low-cost public housing was made available to black families. The National Youth Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, enabled African American youths to continue their education. The Works Progress Administration gave jobs to many African Americans, and its Federal Writers Project supported the work of many Black authors, among them Zora Neale Hurston, Arna Bontemps, Waters Turpin, and Melvin B. Tolson. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, established in the mid 1930s, organized large numbers of Black workers into labor unions for the first time. By 1940, there were more than 200,000 African Americans in the CIO, many of them officers of union locals. World War II. The industrial boom that began with the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939 ended the Depression. However, unemployed whites were generally the first to be given jobs. Discrimination against African Americans in hiring impelled A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, to threaten a mass protest march on Washington. To forestall the march, scheduled for June the 25th of 1941, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government, and establishing a Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate violations. Although discrimination remained widespread during the war, African Americans secured more jobs at better wages in a greater range of occupations than ever before. And that was under Franklin Roosevelt. In World War II, as in World War I, there was a mass migration of Blacks from the rural South. Collectively, these population shifts were known as the Great Migration. Some 1.5 million African Americans left the South during the 40s, mainly for the industrial cities of the North. Once again, serious housing shortages and job competition led to increased tension between Blacks and whites. Race riots broke out. The worst occurred in Detroit in June of 1943. During the war, which the United States had entered in December of 1941, December 7th to be specific, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and we bombed them twice. A large proportion of African American soldiers overseas were in service units, and combat troops remained segregated. In the course of the war, however, the Army introduced integrated officer training, and Benjamin O. Davis Sr. became its first African American brigadier general. In 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II, the armed services finally adopted a policy of full integration. During the Korean War of the early 1950s, Blacks for the first time fought side by side with whites in fully integrated units. The Civil Rights Movement. At the end of World War II, African Americans were poised to make far-reaching demands and to end racism. They were unwilling to give up the minimal gains that had been made during the war. The Campaign for African American Rights, usually referred to as the Civil Rights Movement or the Freedom Movement, went forward in the 1940s and 50s in persistent and deliberate steps. In the courts, the NAACP successfully attacked restrictive covenants in housing, segregation in interstate transportation, and discrimination in public recreational facilities. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued one of its most significant rulings in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. The court overturned the separate but equal ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. That case outlawed the Brown versus Board, outlawed Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal. That's the 1896 clause that created separate schools, and that was the doctrine, separate but equal. So, in the country's public school systems, white citizens councils in the South fought back with legal maneuvers, economic pressure, and even violence. The KKK was not dead. They were totally doing a lot at this time, probably the most. Rioting by white mobs temporarily closed Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, when 9 Black students were admitted to it in 1957, prompting President Dwight D. Eisenhower to dispatch federal troops to protect the students. Direct nonviolent action by African Americans achieved its first major success in the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott of 1955 through 56, led by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. This protest was prompted by the quiet but defiant act of an African American woman. Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus to a white passenger on December the 1st of 1955. Resistance to African American demands for the desegregation of Montgomery's buses was finally overcome when the Supreme Court ruled in November of 1956 that segregation of public transportation facilities was unconstitutional. To coordinate further civil rights action, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was established in 1957 under King's guidance. That's all for your Week 6 commentary video. Stay tuned. See you next time.